Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. We're still coming to you from the National Results Operating Centre here in Midrand at the Gallagher Convention Centre. We continue with our analysis on the political parties and their campaigns as we edge closer to Wednesday's general elections. I'm now joined by political analyst Professor Joleen Steyn Kotze. Professor, good evening and thank you for your time.
Good evening.
Now, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Perhaps to start with reflecting on this moment. We've heard from many how significant a moment it is 30 years into our democracy. Your views?
Well, I think really at a point where if we look at 30 years of democracy, some of the bigger questions that have started coming up, I would say most notably in the public imaginations, are questions on has democracy delivered? Has our dream of 94 really come true? And we find quite often little bit of a mixed message. An older generation will tell you, yes, we fought hard for this freedom. To vote, to have the right to vote, vis-a-vis a younger generation who are possibly struggling in a very difficult economic climate, saying, you know what, no, more needs to be done. I cannot find a job. I don't necessarily think my life has gotten better, so I don't know if I am going to vote.
So what happens now with these political parties that we have? Because most of them have perfectly characterized the problems. There's absolutely no political party that can be faulted insofar as actually zoning in on what it is that needs to happen, be it resolving your load shedding, be it delivering on services, whether it be health, policing, all of those issues. They've perfectly characterized them. But it seems there's something missing there in the how most of them are going to go about doing it. Do you share the views of some that have been quite critical of some of these manifestos, that the how is somewhat missing?
You know, I think for me the core for political parties to really get back to is the core business of building institutions, building strong institutions. So if we are going to say we are going to address poverty and inequality, you would need a strong Ministry of Education that is able to facilitate equality of opportunity, that regardless of whether you went to a public school or a private school, your equality in opportunity remains the same, and that one doesn't draw a distinction. The same goes for your health ministries. So my question then is what are political parties going to do to start rebuilding the institutional core of service delivery on the one hand, but also critically important, good governance on the other hand.
But now when we talk good governance, there's now the spanner in the works, which is the fact that many are saying one-party dominance is going out of the window. We're no longer going to have that. We're going to have a number of political parties having to work together. They have divergent views. They are from different political persuasions. What does that mean for good governance then?
Well, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned at the local government level, and some of the experiences we've had since 2016. And that is that political parties, I think, need to start moving away from a very antagonistic form of campaigning and characterizing when they engage one another, more towards a collaborative relationship. So ideally, what I would have liked to see, for example, would have been political parties having open conversations around, in the event that we need to work together, what can we agree is our policy agenda going to be for the next 5 years? What is the tone of relationship we are going to have for the next 5 years, not for our own political expediency, but for the common good?
But it hasn't been the culture in South Africa for many political parties heading into elections. Most of them are very bullish. They all talk of possibly getting that 2/3 majority. We've even heard with MK. So most of the parties almost put until the very last minute a conversation around coalitions, which becomes the problem because they've only got 14 days even.
Well, exactly, and I think again, if you reflect back on some of the lessons learned around coalitions, we do know that a very unstable coalition environment, for lack of a better phrasing, creates an unstable political institution. It creates instability in governance, in service delivery. So instability then actually starts undermining that mandate of service delivery. And within that context, that is where political parties will need to start reimagining how they do politics on the one hand, but also on the other hand, how they relate to one another, how they engage to one another. Are they able to find common ground for cooperation?
But are you honestly of the view that we've seen the last of one-party dominance?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm going to also say that my crystal ball might be broken because I think this election is very much around the possibilities. So yes, there is a possibility that the ANC may not get its normal 60, 63, 66%. It's a possibility the ANC may have a reduced majority. It's a possibility that we can see a coalition government. So I think we need to be very careful and we need to be open-minded that when we are having these discussions, we are talking about possibilities and possible scenarios, but we do have to wait for the votes to start coming in and for the public to speak their mind in terms of the direction that they are pushing the country in.
Because the African National Congress has constantly stated that when it comes to polls, it seems for them the outcome just always predicts them to be very, very lower than what they end up having on the day. So if we moved now with a recent poll, they moved from 37% last week. They were polled, I think on Friday it was, at around 45. And many were asking, what can this increase now be attributed to? That not so long ago they were just doing dismally. And then suddenly there's this shoot. Does it indicate that perhaps the other parties failed to resonate with the electorate, or really the ANC at the end of it now, closer to the time, has been really taking the message or driving the message home to the electorate?
No, very often, and I think we also need to bear in mind a lot of things can shift and happen on election day. Also factors that would influence whether people actually go out to the polls and vote. And then more importantly, whose party's voters are going out to go and vote, who is committed enough to a particular political party agenda to say, I'm going to go out, even if it's raining, to go and cast my vote for this political party. So there are a lot of factors that start coming into play when we start looking at some of the polling and we start trying to make those predictions, which is why I like to err on the side of caution and say we are playing with scenarios, but we do also need to bear in mind that we will know more on the day.
Indeed, but if we had to play with those scenarios, Gauteng, KZN, some analysts say they're as good as gone. There'll have to be some sort of a coalition if the ANC is to govern. Your take on just some of the predictions around these two provinces?
You know, I think Gauteng and KZN in particular are very interesting case studies, if I can use that word. So for me, you have the introduction of a new political player, the MK. We of course know that there's also predictions around huge support for the MK possibly coming in KZN as well as Gauteng, possibly taking those provinces. What I would say is that if you look at just Gauteng, and that is where coalitions for me are going to become important, Gauteng is often characterized as the economic hub of the country. So in terms of keeping the economic hub of the country going, what conversations have political parties had with one another to prepare for the possible scenario that yes, we might have a coalition scenario here? If no conversations have occurred, then we could see that instability start playing out in terms of coalition dynamics and political expediency. If one takes it a step further and we say, right, KZN and Gauteng are as good as gone, we will have a new party in power. That of course gives whichever political party the opportunity to showcase what it is that they are able to do within a 5-year period of time. Actually, I would maybe reverse that and go a bit shorter, let's say 3 years, because then local government elections also start coming into play.
Which some say we should look to local government elections as some sort of a legitimate poll, because it was the last time that many people went to the elections to a certain extent. But now if we go back to the Gauteng and KZN dynamic, it's said that if the ANC were to focus on Mpumalanga, focus on Limpopo and the Eastern Cape, because they mostly are very strong in these three provinces, that here the national picture could change in their favor. Because if we look at Mpumalanga right now, you've got the chair of the ANC being Mandla Ndlovu, the EFF's chair is Colin Sedibe, the DA's chair is Jane Sithole. The ANC continues to be very strong, enjoy a lot of support in Mpumalanga, even though they've done away with the strongman politics because Didi Mabuza now is no longer the chair there. But do you think Mpumalanga ANC could actually garner the 80% that it said the president of the ANC would need them to ensure they get?
again, it's a difficult question around crystal balls, right? So I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to frame it within what is commonly known as the heartland of the ANC, which is the Eastern Cape, of course.
Yes.
So if we look at the story of the Eastern Cape and we look at the story of the African National Congress in the Eastern Cape, we have noticed over the last number of general elections at provincial level a very, very steady decline in terms of support for the African National Congress. However, opposition political parties were not necessarily able to make sufficient inroads in what was considered ANC strongholds. So the story there was one of voters not necessarily going out to vote. So the ANC was not able to get voters in its strongholds to go to the polls. And I think that is going to be where the proof in the pudding lies when it comes to provinces like Mpumalanga and Limpopo on the day. Will voters be going out to the poll to cast their votes for their political parties? Will the ANC be able to maintain its strongholds? And critically, will opposition parties be able to penetrate those strongholds even if voter turnout is quite low in those areas?
Then beyond voter turnout to policy certainty, this is something that the business community always wants to see. The NHI bill, the signing thereof, it seems to have alienated the business community. According to them, some of them have threatened to take legal action against government, and many have even gone as far as saying possibly that could work against the African National Congress government. Your take on that?
You know, I think there are some critical conversations around the business community, government and government's policy positions that needs to happen. And I think if we just look at the very basics of human rights, human dignity, your right to healthcare, that is a not negotiable. But we also know that there's quite a lot of state dysfunction within public hospitals. So I think there are valid concerns on both sides. On the one hand, you see a policy directive geared towards trying to have a full realization of human rights through the provision of effective and adequate health care. But on the other hand, you have a business community that might be concerned with some of the dysfunction we have seen in some of these public institutions. And I do think that, you know, whether we call it to say the business community is now going to be alienated or the ANC has, you know, not necessarily followed the correct policy procedure here, regardless of that, there does need to be a conversation, almost a bit of a social compact between business, government, private sector and civil society, because ultimately that is the only way you would be able to start dealing, and we're using the NHI now as to kind of pivot this statement. It's the only way you are going to start dealing with the major societal challenges around the provision of public health, the provision around electricity, the provision of education does need that social compact and that partnership.
So meaning giving the private sector a greater role in the country would probably be more beneficial even to government insofar as assisting with the delivery of services.
Well, definitely, I would argue that, and to say that that is also a form of essential buy-in that you would need. But it's a very fine line, of course, right? Because you cannot have, excuse me, private interest dictating what government's policy positions are going to be. Government, after all, is representative of the people.
And it's said that with the private sector, they are for profit. They'd like to argue that they also do want to make a difference socially, but essentially they were designed for profit. So in most instances, some would say you'd end up commodifying that which is supposed to be services for the ordinary citizens.
Exactly, and that is where that fine line, that fine balancing act and those necessary conversations need to happen. So as much as I would argue and say that political parties need to be talking to one another, so too does government need to be talking with stakeholders involved in the broader scheme of delivering that better life, of taking South Africa forward.
If we had to honestly look at the manifestos, do you believe that ordinary citizens who perhaps to this moment are undecided as to which party to vote for, do you believe that most of these parties have properly articulated their message of what they want to do if they were to become government in just those documents, their manifestos?
You know, one will need a specific polling exercise for that to try and determine, you know, how people received the manifestos of the different political parties. But I would venture and go out and see what we've seen in some of our research, the bread and butter issues that ordinary South Africans deal with. And we can take it a step further and say your poor South Africans, piecemeal work. I don't know where my next meal is going to come from. I don't know how I'm going to feed my family tomorrow night. The promise of a job, the promise of electricity, the promise of all of those things that different political parties make may not necessarily fall on a very open ear to those promises, because their lived realities are just something completely different. The lived reality is one of being slightly disconnected from democratic aspirations, and of course we've heard this, you cannot eat your vote. Yeah. That is something that has popped out quite often, and I think that is where the challenge lies for political parties, is breaking down that perception that political parties only go out when it's voting time, election season, in order to get people to vote for them, but after that people do not see political parties. And for me, I think it would be quite critical that political parties need to sustain that momentum if they do want to regain the trust of the undecided voter, or the voter who has decided, I am not going to vote, because that is also exercising a form of political choice.
In this very young democracy of ours, do you believe that the political parties that have been campaigning have the maturity, the political maturity to work together, should it come down to it, nationally?
You know, I think the eternal optimist in us all would want to say yes. You know, we are at a critical moment, we are at a critical juncture, I believe, in our country. We do need to bear in mind that we are, I would still argue, relatively early post-COVID days, very difficult economic climate. We need confidence in government. We need confidence in our institutions. And I would hope that through their manifestos, political parties would have articulated their policy positions in the spirit of cooperation with one another, should it get to that point.
I want to shift our focus to the IEC and how they have acquitted themselves. It's been a very difficult climate, a litigious nation we have become. Throughout their elections timetable, they've been hauled before the courts, they've duly complied, defended some of their matters and their decisions. Your take on just how they have acquitted themselves?
You know, I think we need to bear in mind that if we look at institutions and we look at public trust in institutions, generally speaking, public trust is declining around various institutions. However, that said, trust in the IEC has remained relatively stable. So the IEC is one of our democratic institutions that does enjoy public trust. And therefore, I think it is critical for the IEC, as you'd mentioned, to maintain and take due course in order to ensure that all parties abide by the rules of the game, the electoral rules of the game. You know, that is a critical question, again, if you then start looking at electoral integrity. Do people believe that our elections were free and fair, and that the IEC has delivered a free and fair election? So in order to sustain that public trust and to sustain our electoral integrity, I think we do need to appreciate the work that the IEC has in fact done.
And then beyond that, when we look at just the incidents, many had said, given that these are said to be the most consequential elections since those of 1994, that possibly there was going to be a degree, heightened degree of political intolerance. But when speaking to the IEC, they seem to be fairly okay with how the political parties have conducted themselves post-signing that electoral code of conduct. Your take on just how they have conducted themselves?
Political parties, I think we had some disagreements around questions of electoral integrity over the weekend, as we saw in the news from some political parties, and I do think that is where one can applaud the IEC for really stepping up and coming forward and dealing with that as expediently and as quickly as they had done. Looking at political intolerance, and again this is where campaigning starts coming in. We have a I want to use the word political culture, but it's too broad to say we've got quite an antagonistic way of engaging one another politically. You know, if you have political parties who do not necessarily agree with one another, it is not a friendly let's agree to disagree position. It does actually get quite heated at times, and I think from that perspective the IEC possibly could say, you know what, there hasn't been any major incidences around political intolerance or exclusions for that matter, or let's say for argument's sake no-go zones or anything that would be of major concern, but we are keeping a watchful eye on how parties are conducting themselves as we move closer to 29 May.
But of course we cannot deny that we have seen a lot of political killings, in as much as the IEC would not link any particular killings right now to this campaigning period. But what can we attribute the resorting to violence ever so often politically?
You know, that is also quite an interesting question, and I think it's one of those areas of research, right, that is much needed, but nobody wants to talk about it, which makes it very difficult. That we do know questions around political killings, what we have seen very often could be linked not necessarily to a specific party position, but rather individual agendas.
Or careerism, as many have said,
exactly.
That it is in fact a lucrative career.
It is a lucrative career. So you kind of have these individual agendas and, you know, trying to work your way up, so to speak, the political ladder, and this person might be in my way or might be standing against me getting some form of benefit from the political organization or the political structure. You know, so we can say, yes, political killings is a reality. However, the extent to which that is linked specifically to campaigning remains to be seen.
There are other new entrants. We all know that the ballot paper this time around will have there'll be three ballot papers, pardon me. Independents. I watched one specific documentary of one independent who documented what they have gone through, Zaki Ahmad. He even had to get a loan to partake in these elections. It still remains very difficult. There's not many people who would be able to take out a loan in the regions of millions.
No, you know, I think if we look at how the political system is set up, it is not necessarily set up for independence. Bearing in mind we work on a closed list system traditionally. So that means you and I go out, we elect a political party, and the political party will then decide the persons who will be our representatives within Parliament. Again, political parties need huge resources, and we have heard the EFF, for example, complaining, saying the barriers of entry is just too high for new political parties. So now we take the complaints of a political party that's able to get donations, sponsorships, you know, all of those income streams, and you ask an individual to do the exact same thing. And again, that is going to be a conversation that will need to happen around electoral reform. For example, are you going to have what we see at local government level, where you've got your ward system with your PR system?
Yes.
Can we translate that more towards a national, to have a more direct link of accountability, so that it's not the political party who holds underperforming representatives accountable, but actually the electorate.
Professor, thank you very much for your time this evening. That's political analyst Professor Joleen Steyn Kotze speaking to us.